Hello, I'm Yunakivka. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we're tracking the latest plot twist in Vladimir Putin's northern novella, the push from buffer zone to bona fide front line in the Sumy region. Remember when Russia made a hasty retreat from northern Ukraine back in 2022? Well, apparently, they've been hitting the treadmill ever since, and now they're back in Sumy, knees creaking. We'll be taking stock of the frontline changes in Ukraine, what has been instrumental in Russia's push from the north and east, and how does it influence Moscow's position in this war. So without further ado, let's take a glance at our latest report to find out more.
For the first time since early 2022, Russian forces have established a small foothold in Ukraine's Dnipropetrovsk region, according to reports from the New York Times. Small groups of Russian soldiers recently crossed from the occupied Donetsk region into Dnipropetrovsk, marking a symbolic and strategic move rather than a large-scale offensive. Though no settlements have been seized and the advance has been limited to a few tree lines, military analysts suggest this incursion may be intended to undermine Ukrainian morale and reinforce Russian positions nearby. Analysts say that Russia has concentrated a substantial force near the border and could push further. On Sunday, Russia's defense ministry stated that tank units had reached the western edge of Donetsk and were advancing into Dnipropetrovsk. However, Ukrainian authorities have not officially confirmed Russian troop presence in the region. The move comes as Russia maintains the initiative on the battlefield and resists calls for a ceasefire, despite ongoing negotiation attempts. Russian officials have reportedly considered occupying additional regions like Dnipropetrovsk or Sumy as leverage in peace talks. With a pre-war population of 3 million and significant industrial importance, deeper Russian advances into Dnipropetrovsk could severely impact Ukraine's military and economic stability.
And now let's zone in on the east-plaining portion of our show. Russian forces are making slow but steady advances in Ukraine's northeastern Sumy region. The development comes as part of an attempt by Moscow to establish a buffer zone along the front line.
Ukrainian regional authorities confirmed that multiple local villages have been occupied by Russian troops. Russian President Vladimir Putin recently declared plans to create security zones to shield Russian border regions near Sumy, Kharkiv and Chernihiv. Despite limited territorial gains, estimated at just 1 kilometer in 2 weeks, Russia continues to use small mobile units on motorbikes and buggies to avoid drone detection. Despite Ukrainian forces reinforcing defensive lines since 2022, Sumy remains under constant threat, facing over 30 guided bomb strikes since Saturday alone. Analysts view the incursion as a distraction, intended to stretch Ukraine's resources while Russia focuses on the Donbas region. Although a major breakthrough in Sumy appears unlikely for now, the buffer zone narrative may serve as future Russian leverage in negotiations.
And now, as always, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now, in March 2025, Ukrainian forces beat a strategic retreat from Sudzha in the Kursk region, and you could almost hear the champagne corks popping in Moscow. Fast forward to June, the villages have fallen and Russian troops are within 20 kilometers of Sumy city. It's striking how little attention this advance has received in the Western media cycle. Instead, everyone's minds are on the peace talks, which Russia clearly doesn't treat seriously. While Kiev strains to hold a sliver of Kursk and defends Donetsk with every last drone, Sumy hovers in the shadows like the forgotten middle sibling of Ukraine's embattled regions. Journalists have been barred from the front north of Sumy, suggesting that if you can't see it, it isn't happening. Except, well, it is. Fighting erupted around Yunakivka, a strategic waypoint on the Sudzha-Sumy highway, turning a vital lifeline into a perilous gauntlet. On the 12th of June, President Zelenskyy claimed Ukraine had pushed the enemy back in places. Whether these gains hold is anyone's guess. However, Moscow boasts of holding over 200 square kilometers in the Sumy region, a footprint rivaling its May 2024 gains near Kharkiv. Now, Russia's narrative spins this push as a defensive masterstroke. Putin's May announcement of a security buffer zone along Ukraine's northern border sounded like an offer you can't refuse. If by offer you mean we will occupy your land, and by security you mean security deposit, one that we will never return. Alexei Zhuravlev of the State Duma agreed, clarifying that a 100-kilometer buffer zone is actually sufficient. Translation: give us the keys to your living room, kitchen, and maybe your neighbor's garden as well. This relentless pressure compounds Ukraine's struggles. With hundreds of kilometers of front line to defend, chronic infantry shortages and logistic channels sniped by enemy drones constantly, Ukrainian commanders face a Sisyphean task: plug one hole and two more open elsewhere. Russia's goal isn't just land, but leverage, forcing Ukraine to siphon forces to Sumy, weakening defenses in Donetsk, Kharkiv, and beyond. Ukrainian fortifications along the border were supposed to be the home field advantage. Two defensive lines built by brigades and combat engineers, a third by civilian contractors. Instead, what emerged were platoon strongpoints, scattered bunkers in open fields, perfect targets for enemy reconnaissance drones. So, what is the remedy? Well, Ukraine needs soldiers, fortifications, and most critically, Western support in heavy weapons and air defense. Because if the world learned anything from this buffer-to-front metamorphosis, it's that half measures only embolden Moscow's appetite for expansion. In the Kremlin's garden of geopolitical weeds, neglecting one patch invites a full-blown infestation. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Bogdan Nailo, editor-in-chief at the Kyiv Post. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
My pleasure to be with you.
So the focus today is on the Sumy region of Ukraine. How determined do you think are the Russians to either try and take the region or at least to inflict major damage upon its population?
I think that they're determined to take as much land as possible, because what we're seeing is not just limited to the Sumy region, but in the Dnipropetrovsk region, Zaporizhia regions. There's a feeling that the Russians, the Kremlin, sense that somewhere down the road they will be forced to temporarily at least agree to a ceasefire or some kind of suspended war situation. And so the effort is to grab as much as they can and hold on to it, to inflict terror on Ukrainian cities, in the meantime to try and weaken the resolve of the Ukrainian population to fight back, and to show the West that really with America under Trump not pulling its weight, not supporting Ukraine as it should, that Ukraine is effectively a hopeless cause, and therefore don't waste your money on weapons, financial support, etc.
And this is a valid point that I hope we will explore further when it comes to the amount of aid that is being provided. But before we do, does Russia have the capacity to actually fulfill the demands which are apparently being made of its commanders and its servicemen, suggesting that Russia would like to take up as much as half of Ukrainian territory by 2026? Now, this could be wishful thinking on Putin's part, but could it happen realistically? Are we rather looking at a more limited series of incursions?
It can happen realistically if America continues its policy under Trump of standing back and appeasing or even acting in collusion with Putin, and if the Europeans, despite their strong statements of support, the coalition of the willing, the committed, if you want, if they don't follow through and follow from words to actions, meaning not just the financial, political, moral support, but weapons, particularly air defense mechanisms, long-range artillery, rockets, whatever is needed to stop the Russians advancing. You see, the main advantage that the Russians have is their size, the size of their population, and their total disregard for the human factor, for human lives. So they can afford to just send wave after wave after wave of men who die, who perish, who are made invalids without really looking back and giving it a second thought. The Ukrainians can't afford that. And also their weaponry is limited in terms of what they can produce. They're producing a lot of drones, for example, but they are dependent on Western support to keep their weapons flow, munitions flow going enough to sustain their defense.
So what is the biggest problem right now when it comes to European support? It has been pointed out, for example, that while Europe is actually providing military support to Ukraine as well as financial aid, it is regrettably also indirectly financing the Russian war machine through purchases of Russian natural resources, which regrettably still continue.
That's very true. It's a very good point. I mean, the European countries should impose a much stricter embargo on the use of Russian energy sources, particularly oil, and also use the assets that they've frozen, seized, if you want, from the Russians as a means of supporting Ukraine's war effort on behalf of Europe, because Ukraine is fighting not only for its own survival, but to keep the Russians out of advancing further into Europe.
So do you think that statements, which you can often see among commentators, that NATO member states have become involved in helping Israel fight off ballistic missiles and drones launched from Iran, that if NATO countries did the same for the Ukrainian airspace, this would have been a game changer, but they don't want to. Do you think these accusations are justified given the situation? And is it something that should be considered? Ukraine has been calling for this sort of thing from the very start, but these calls have fallen on deaf ears throughout the more than 3 years of war so far.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think that, double standards have been applied, particularly by the States, but in the past by some of America's allies and Israel's allies. They have responded to close the skies over Israel in the past from offshore, including Britain and others. But they haven't done the same really, or at least openly, with regard to Ukraine. Even this night, and as we speak on Tuesday morning, there's been a terrible, terrible all-night attack, non-stop. I think the worst that I've experienced here and my staff. It was not just the sirens going, it was the explosions, the thuds, the sound of drones overhead. This is going on at a time when, international attention is again diverted to the Middle East, to the Iran-Israeli conflict, war show in effect. And many people in the outside world, the majority probably forget that there is a war going on, that Ukraine is constantly, every day, under this kind of fire that Israel is experiencing at this moment, that Iran's experiencing. We've been going through this at least for the last 3.5 years of the all-out Russian war, but for over 10 years, given Russia's seizure of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So, there are double standards, and if at least the skies were closed with the weaponry needed and not diverted, as America has just done, diverted its air defenses to the Middle East, ostensibly to protect American lives. Ironically, an American was killed this very night in Kyiv, an American, and 5 Ukrainians have been killed in Tel Aviv by the Iranian drones hitting Israel. So it's all interconnected. Remember that Iran is an ally of Russia, providing it with the drones, the Shaheds that are hitting Ukraine every single day, and Moscow is a firm backer of Iran. It's not just Ukraine in isolation. This is a much more complex international situation, but the linkages are not always apparent to those who should know better.
So it is actually important to point this out, right? That, this war has been raging on for years, and these attacks are unfortunately the daily reality of average Ukrainians. Now, coming back to the Sumy region, do you think it is defensible? Do you think that there is something that can be done to prevent any sort of incursion? And of course, for the sake of clarity, we should add that the distance between the city of Sumy and the border with Russia is about 20 kilometers. So this places this city within the reach of rocket artillery, so not just long-range weapons, right, but attacks and bombardment, which is more difficult to intercept. What do you think can be done to prevent this city becoming literally hell on earth? And Russia, unfortunately, does have the tradition of doing this. It did so in Syria, for example, years ago. And it is likewise using the same approach when approaching larger population centers in Ukraine.
Well, Sumy is one of the major targets. Obviously, it's very vulnerable. It's on, as you say, it's on the actual border. The Ukrainians are holding firm, but they've lost a little ground, which has put Sumy in danger, within reach of artillery fire, shall we say. For the moment, I think the Ukrainians will manage to keep the Russians out. But as I said at the outset, it depends on what sort of help they can rely on from the outside in terms of weaponry, not boots on the ground, and also redeploying their forces. The other point I made earlier on is that we are witnessing a full frontal assault by the Russians. It's not just Sumy. There's just to the south is Kharkiv. There's very strong bombardment going on Kharkiv. The Russians, I think, at the outset of the war had planned to take not only Kiev, but certainly Kharkiv and Sumy. Kharkiv for them was a kind of symbol because it's the second largest city in Ukraine, was largely Russian-speaking, and they felt that it was theirs to take. Kharkiv has held firm, and though the majority of its population, as I've just said, is Russian-speaking, it's become more Ukrainian than ever in its history since at least the early 19th century. But the Russians are also trying to break through in the center into the Dnipropetrovsk region, which is very dangerous because these regions in the south haven't been as well protected because most of the fighting has been further east and further north, in the Lugansk, Donetsk, Sumy, Kharkiv regions. So this is a weak point, an Achilles heel, if you want, in the Ukrainians' defense, close to Zaporizhia, close to the largest nuclear power station in Europe, which is, a time bomb that the Russians will use as blackmail and are using, and of course down in the south. So it's a full frontal assault. Once again, I want to stress that for the Russians, life is not a factor. They can throw thousands each day. They're losing, on average, in the last 6 months, 1,500 men a day in 24 hours. Very few countries could sustain that sort of casualty rate. And of course, Ukrainians are losing too, not at the same rate, not on the same scale, but of course it is having an impact on the Ukrainian army and the forces that they have.
Bogdan Nailo was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. The public trust in Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has declined by 11 percentage points since May. The figures were published in the newest poll conducted by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology.
The survey found that 65% of Ukrainians trust Zelenskyy, while 30% do not, yielding a trust balance of plus 35%, the lowest since March 2025. Though still above the February 2025 low of 57%, the drop reflects growing war fatigue, pressure for a ceasefire, and waning momentum from Zelenskyy's earlier diplomatic success with a US minerals agreement. Regional differences are stark. 73% in western Ukraine trust the president, compared to 61% in the conflict-hit south and east of the country. Domestic attitudes on territorial concessions also vary. Among Zelenskyy's supporters, 55% oppose agreeing to any compromises. In contrast, 46% of those who distrust the Ukrainian president are willing to cede land. The results highlight deepening divides as the war continues, with no clear end in sight.
I will answer on more serious questions.
Grassroots fundraising efforts for the Russian military have slowed significantly in 2024. Public donations dropped to approximately $150 million that year, down from around $500 million back in 2023.
According to an investigation by the exiled independent Russian news outlet Vyorstka, the pace of donations has drastically slowed. Fundraisers that once met targets within hours now take weeks, prompting organizers to use increasingly emotional appeals, including comparisons of donating to daily coffee or transit costs. The decline is attributed in part to growing war fatigue and the public perception that the ongoing peace talks signal an imminent end to hostilities. Trust is also eroding due to a lack of transparency, with most funds funneled through personal accounts and few detailed financial reports. Even registered non-profits have ceased publishing statements, further fueling suspicions of misuse and fraud.
The Russian treasury is hoping for an influx of funds following the recent escalation between Israel and Iran. Russia's Urals crude oil, a major source of revenue for the Kremlin, crucial for maintaining and financing Moscow's war machine, surged nearly 15%.
Prices rose from around $57 to $65 per barrel, recovering from a two-year low, but still below the government's revised target of $68.90, according to Russian BCS Financial Group analysts. Despite an average of roughly $76 per barrel in early 2025, oil and gas revenues fell 10% year-on-year in the first quarter and plunged 34% by May. Monthly Russian energy revenues dropped to $6.66 billion, the lowest since January 2023.
And that's all for now on this episode of Eastern Express. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.